conversation with a Roman Catholic friend of mine regarding justification.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the arguments he brings up, I first encountered from James Aiken, actually, from the Catholic Answers, regarding Paul's use in Romans 4 of Abraham being justified in Genesis 15.
Yep.
And then going to Hebrews chapter 11, which he had indicated had suggested that Abraham had also been justified earlier in Genesis
12.
chapter 12, when he leaves home, builds an altar to God and whatnot. So I just want to get your thoughts about that. And, clearly I don't certainly think that indicates that there's a progressive justification or anything, but that's kind of where he's getting at.
Or a repetitive justification, which would basically require that Abraham was committing a lot of mortal sins, because he would be justified in Genesis 12, Genesis 15, and Genesis 22. Because they'll also argue that he's justified in Genesis 22 based on James chapter 2. So there's a whole section on this, and I think it is in the chapter on Romans chapter 4 in The God Who Justifies. So there's a lengthy written discussion of this in light of the fact that, in essence, the Roman Catholic apologetic at this point, and it is something that comes from Jimmy Aiken and Tim Staples and that group of Roman Catholic apologists have been utilizing this for a while, and we've been responding to it just as long. Robertson, Genis, people like that, especially back when they were all in the same circles and before they all divided up. But anyway, the problem is this is an argument against Paul, because Paul's entire argument, if you follow it in chapter 4, and I'm not sure if you saw my sermon on Sunday, but was
not able to stream that one now.
Yeah, it'll be up on YouTube before long, I would imagine, while we can still post stuff there. But I did do 4:16 through 5:1 basically at Apologia on Sunday, and but one of the things I did mention is the issue of the blessed man in 4:8, 4:7, 4:8, and the fact that in Roman Catholicism there is no blessed man. I don't know if you've discussed that with your friend, or what answer he's...
Yes, it's actually a point that I've brought up with him as well, using your own material, which I'm very thankful for. Right,
but there really isn't a consistent answer. I mean, Peter Stravinskas actually first said it was Jesus, and then said, well, I hope to be. And if you take that perspective, then the rest of chapter 4 is not going to make any sense, especially verse 9, is this blessing? And that blessing is the non-imputation of sin. You go back to verse 6, just as David also speaks of the blessing on the man to whom God credits righteousness apart from works. And then he interprets the positive imputation in verse 6, because that's logizomai. That's the term to impute. So the blessedness of man to whom God imputes righteousness apart from works. And then he goes back to Psalm 32, Psalm 31, the Greek Septuagint, and he defines it as the non-imputation of sin. So the positive imputation of righteousness is interpreted by the apostle in light of the non-imputation of sin and the fulfillment in 4, 7, and 8. But then here's the key. Is this blessing then on the circumcised or on the uncircumcised also? For we say faith was credited to Abraham as righteousness. Now, what is the apostolic example? The apostolic example that grounds his interpretation of the imputation of positive righteousness, the non-imputation of sin in Psalm 32 is Genesis 15. Which is the second most commonly cited text from the Old Testament in the New, thanks to Paul. So he then says in verse 9, when was this? Is this blessing then on the circumcised or the uncircumcised also? For we say it was reckoned. How then, verse 10, was it reckoned? And then you have in peritome anti, en acrobustia. So while he was circumcised or uncircumcised. So it is a temporal argument. If Abraham is justified in Paul's understanding of what it means to be made right with God in Genesis 22, which has been argued because it says the same thing in Genesis 22. He offers Isaac. That's James 2. If that's the case, then his entire argument here collapses because he was circumcised then. So Paul knows when he was circumcised, and so he's making the argument this was done in non-circumcision so as to deal with the issue of the sign. But the Genesis 12, let's keep something in mind. Where is the first reference to belief or faith in the Bible? Most people don't know. It's Genesis 15. There is nothing mentioned in Genesis chapter 12. Now, but Hebrews 11. Yes, in going back and looking at obedience and things like that, you do find that. But Genesis 12 does not use that term. Genesis 15 does. That's the introduction. And what's the key difference between the prophetic promise found in Genesis 12 and then what happens in Genesis 15? I think this is really, really important for people to see this. I mean, this would be something to do big, long discussions on, but we're doing it in a phone call. What's the difference? Genesis 15 is the establishment of the covenant. And if you look at it, and most people haven't looked at it, unfortunately, and when they do look at it, their eyes sort of glaze over for one real obvious reason. Why is God cutting animals up and then a smoking pot is going between the cut up parts of the animals? And I don't get this. And it's because they don't understand the covenantal background of that time period and what that's supposed to mean today. This is God literally cutting a covenant and making a covenant. And it's in the context of God making the covenant that man responds in faith. And Abram believes God, and it was reckoned to him as righteousness. So when you Paul says he received the sign of circumcision, a seal of the righteousness of faith which he had while uncircumcised, so that he might be the father of all who believe without being circumcised, that righteousness might be credited to them. Now again, there's no crediting of righteousness in the Roman sacramental system. So this whole section is just a little bit outside of Roman understanding in application of gospel categories. But the argument is with Paul. And in fact, I've pointed out to people, that's the kind of argument I have a feeling the Jews brought up against Paul in the synagogues. And I don't want to be on their side. That's not a good side to be on. And so the question to ask is, faith is first mentioned in Genesis 15. It's the first time you have covenant promises that can be believed in. Genesis 12 is important because God talks about how he's going to bless the world, but he does not provide that covenantal relationship until Genesis chapter 15. The apostle sees that as the key. He makes that the temporal marker of when Abraham is justified so that the offering of Isaac does not become a quote-unquote re-justification, but a demonstration of the reality of the faith that he had back in Genesis 15. And yes, Abraham is obedient to the call, and it is that obedience that is being praised in Hebrews chapter 11. But Hebrews chapter 11 isn't talking about justification. It's not talking about imputed righteousness. It's exhorting believers in light of those who've come before as to how they're to live their life. So keep the categories straight, and the apostle doesn't end up contradicting himself. If you don't, he ends up contradicting himself.
Yep, that makes good sense. I very much appreciate it. It's a question that I've been kind of struggling to answer for a little bit now, but I will definitely get back to some of your material and hopefully find some more on it to offer a good, straightforward answer just like that. So I very much appreciate it, Dr.
All right. Thanks for your call. All right. God bless.
Have a good one.
All right. Bye-bye.